The fog over Elm Hollow. The village of Elm Hollow was on the edge of a dense forest in the heart of America. It had a population of barely 200, and life was so slow and measured that time seemed to stand still. Behind this idyll, however, something dark lurked. The old-timers of the village avoided mentioning the days when the fog came down from the hills. They knew that if the fog stayed longer than usual, it meant that it brought something from the forest with it. People were disappearing. Animals died strange, unnatural deaths. And the creepy thing is, no one ever found the bodies. Lena and Mike Cooper, a young couple from the big city, moved to Elm Hollow to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They bought an old house on the outskirts of the village, a large but dilapidated mansion surrounded by century-old oak trees. When the locals saw them, they exchanged meaningful glances, but didn't say anything. The first night, Lena noticed that the forest seemed to come alive after sunset. She heard strange sounds, whispering, knocking, and even someone singing softly. Mike waved it off, explaining it was a play of imagination, but he wasn't sleeping well himself. A few days later, Mike went to town on business, leaving Lena alone. At night, waking up with the feeling that someone was watching her, she heard a whisper just outside the window. "Give them back. Give them back to me." With a creaking heart, Lena turned on the flashlight and illuminated the yard. There was no one. Only a thick fog drifted across the ground, wrapping everything around her. She thought she saw shadows in the fog, but she convinced herself it was just nerves. The next morning, Mike returned, but his mood was strange. He was silent, avoided making eye contact with Lena, and often left the house, ostensibly to go for a walk. Lena's curiosity grew. She decided to talk to Miss Harper, an old lady who had lived in the village since its founding. Miss Harper told Lena about the legend. The forest has never been ordinary. It is said that hundreds of years ago it was home to sorcerers who worshipped an ancient spirit. They made sacrifices to it to protect themselves. When the spirit was satiated, it disappeared. But if it is disturbed, it will return. And then disaster was inevitable. Lena didn't believe in legends, but Ms. Harper's words struck a chord with her. A week later, Mike disappeared. In the morning, Lena found only his shoes on the doorstep, as if he had gone out barefoot. She looked for him all day, but none of the locals saw where he had gone. That night, the fog descended on the village again. Now Lena heard more than just whispers. Someone was calling her name. She tried to ignore it, but by midnight the sounds had gotten so loud that she ran outside. A cloaked figure stood in the center of the courtyard. "Where's Mike?" Lena shouted. The figure didn't answer, but only pointed with its hand toward the woods. With a flashlight and a knife, Lena set off into the woods. The road was drowning in thick fog, and the whispers grew louder and louder. She felt that something was watching her. Soon she came upon a strange clearing surrounded by trees with symbols carved into the bark. In the center of the clearing stood an altar, and on it lay a sack. Gathering her courage, Lena opened the bag. Inside were old photographs. All of the people depicted were faceless, their faces erased, as if someone had erased them from reality. Among the photos, Lena found a picture of Mike. Lena heard heavy footsteps behind her and turned around. Mike was standing in front of her, but his eyes were empty, like a doll's. He spoke in a strange, inhuman voice. "You disturbed the forest. You belong to it now." Lena ran, but it was as if the mist had become alive, grabbing her arms and legs. She fell, losing consciousness. Lena woke up in her house as if nothing had happened. Mike was beside her, smiling and friendly. But when Lena went out into the yard, she saw that the village was empty. The houses were abandoned, the roads overgrown with grass. She returned to the house and realized that her reflection in the mirror was gone. Now she too was now a prisoner of Elm Hollow. Trying to realize what had happened, Lena began to explore her house. She noticed that it seemed to have changed. The walls were wider, the windows smaller, and the rooms darker. Every movement she made was accompanied by a slight echo, as if the house was eavesdropping. When she looked into the living room, she saw a book on the floor that hadn't been there before. It had no title or author on the cover, and the pages were scrawled with strange symbols like those she had seen on trees in the forest. Opening the book, Lena felt a strange dizziness. It seemed to her that the words in the book were whispering something to her. She heard a voice, the same one that sounded in the fog. Read. Learn the truth. Lena began to read. The book said that many centuries ago in these forests lived a tribe that worshipped an ancient spirit. The spirit gave them strength, protected them from enemies, but required sacrifices. Every year, the tribe sacrificed their elder. One day, however, when the spirit was refused sacrifice, it placed a curse on the land, making it a place where reality and nightmares intersected. Since then, anyone who disturbs this forest becomes part of it, and their souls feed the spirit. Lena realized. She had broken the ban when she had entered the forest in search of Mike. Now she was bound to this place. Lena went up to the second floor, trying to figure out how to get out of this trap. As she passed the mirror, she noticed that her reflection had reappeared. But the reflection was moving differently. It was looking back at her with a crazy smile. "You'll never get out," the reflection said. Terrified, Lena tried to break the mirror, but instead her hand went through the glass. She felt an icy touch and heard the whispers grow louder. The reflection disappeared, but strange things began to happen in the house. Doors opened and closed by themselves, footsteps were heard from the walls, and the shadows outside the windows began to take the shapes of people. Soon Lena heard Mike's voice calling her from the woods. This time she was ready. She took her book, flashlight, and knife with her, intending to confront the spirit. The forest greeted her with dead silence. She found the clearing with the altar again. This time there were new photographs. On one of them she saw herself standing near the house. "It's a trap," Lena whispered, but before she could turn around, she felt someone's breath behind her. Turning around, Lena saw a huge shadow that looked like an amalgamation of human and animal forms. The spirit looked at her with empty, burning eyes. "You have disturbed my land," it said in a low voice, "but I will give you a chance. Bring me a new victim, and I will let you go." Lena realized that the spirit was demanding the same thing from the tribe. If she agreed, she would save herself but doom someone else. Back in the village, Lena realized she was not alone. A new family had just moved into one of the houses. They were a young couple with a child. The spirit didn't rush her, but she felt its presence everywhere. He was watching, he was waiting. Days passed and Lena began to lose touch with reality. The house grew darker and darker, and her reflection whispered to her more and more often, "You know what needs to be done." Lena couldn't let anyone get hurt because of her. She returned to the altar, opened the book, and began reciting the spells she hoped could banish the spirit. The fog grew thicker, the trees stirred, and the spirit appeared before her in its true form, huge and terrible. "You will fail, mortal," it hissed. But Lena kept reading, despite her fear. Shadows began to gather around her, the fog grew denser, and she felt cold hands grasp her shoulders. With the last word of the spell, the spirit let out a piercing scream and then disappeared. The fog cleared and the forest became quiet again. Lena returned to the house, but something was wrong. The village still seemed empty, and the people she'd seen earlier were gone. She checked her reflection, it was gone again. She had defeated the spirit, but realized that she was now part of the curse herself. The spirit had been banished, but its power had passed to her. She was now bound to the forest, guarding its borders. And anyone who entered the mist heard her voice. "Come back. You disturbed it." Days passed, maybe weeks. Time ceased to exist for Lena. She realized she no longer felt hungry or tired. She didn't sleep or eat, just wandered through the woods and the empty streets of Elm Hollow. Every time someone approached the village, she could feel it. The first was a group of hikers who had decided to explore the abandoned villages in the area. They laughed and chatted until they entered the fog. Lena wanted to warn them, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, the fog thickened and the hikers' voices turned into screams. When it subsided, Lena found their backpacks at the edge of the forest. The people were gone. She realized her role now was not to save, but to take away. One day, while wandering through the village, Lena noticed a light on in a house that once belonged to Ms. Harper. Curiosity compelled her to go inside. In an armchair by the fireplace sat an old woman, the same Ms. Harper, only younger than Lena remembered her. "You weren't the first to try to fight," the woman said without raising her eyes. "But the spirit is cunning. It always leaves someone in its place. Now it's your job to keep an eye on the balance." Lena asked if the cycle could be broken. Ms. Harper grinned. "No one knows. Everyone who has tried has become part of the forest. You can try, but are you willing to pay the price?" Lena walked back down the aisle. She knew the clue was in here somewhere. The symbols on the trees seemed familiar to her, as if she had seen them before. Flipping through the book, she found a drawing depicting a ritual. It appeared that the tribe that worshipped the spirit had left a way to imprison it forever. But it required a sacrifice, not just a person, but someone who was already connected to the forest. That meant Lena had to sacrifice herself. Lena began to prepare for the ritual. She gathered the necessary herbs and found a knife that had once belonged to a tribal elder. She knew the spirit would return if it felt threatened. At sunset, Lena stepped out into the clearing again. Around the altar flared fires she hadn't lit. The fog had thickened so that it was impossible to see even her own hands. "Do you really think you can defeat me?" She heard the spirit's voice. Lena raised the knife, but the fog came to life, throwing her to the ground. She felt cold fingers clutching her throat. "You will be mine forever," the spirit whispered. Gathering her last strength, Lena cried out, "I'm not afraid of you." She plunged the knife into her chest. For a moment, the fog disappeared, and Lena saw the starry sky. She felt the heat leave her body, and with it the darkness disappeared. But instead of death, Lena woke up at the edge of the forest. The sun was shining and the village looked alive. People were walking the streets, laughing, greeting her. However, something was wrong. No one recognized her. She was a stranger to everyone. Lena realized. She had freed the village from the curse, but she herself remained its prisoner. She was now a spirit bound to this place. Epilogue. The Eternal Guardian. Every night, Lena wandered through the forest, guarding its borders. She no longer felt fear or pain. She saw each person who tried to enter Elm Hollow and whispered a warning. "Go away, before it's too late." But those who ignored the warning never came back. Many years passed. Elm Hollow was no longer a forgotten place. Rumors spread about the village, and it became a magnet for mystics and paranormal investigators. People came to feel the atmosphere of the legendary curse. They laughed at stories about spirits, recorded videos, and took pictures of the abandoned houses. Lena watched them from the shadows, feeling her connection to the forest and the village grow stronger. Her voice was heard only by those who listened. "Go away." Some heard her and were saved, but not all. The forest began to come alive again, consuming those who went too far. Lena realized that the spirit had returned, despite her sacrifice. One day, a young man named Aiden came to the village. He didn't look like an ordinary tourist. Instead of a camera, he had a backpack with books and artifacts. He clearly knew more about forest magic than the others. Lena followed him. He headed straight for the altar, as if he knew where to find it. In the evening, as the fog thickened, he spread ancient maps and candles in front of him and began to recite strange words. "I know you are here," he said into the void. "You are not a spirit, you were human. Show yourself." Lena felt drawn to him, as if something was binding them together. For the first time in years, she decided to break a rule and show herself to him. "You're making a mistake," she whispered. Aiden flinched, but he wasn't afraid. "If you're here, the spirit hasn't left. You can help me." Aiden told Lena that his family had ties to this land. His ancestor was an elder of the very tribe that had first made a pact with the spirit. He felt a sense of responsibility and intended to finish what he had started. "You have a power that the others do not," he told Lena. "You are part of the forest, but that does not make you its prisoner. You can use its power." Aiden showed Lena a ritual that could break the connection to the spirit forever. To do this, you had to return to the spirit all the souls it had absorbed over the centuries. It could destroy you, he warned. Lena hesitated. She knew that if she didn't try it, the spirit would continue to hunt. Lena and Aiden began to prepare for the ritual. They needed to collect the symbols of the forest, the bits of power associated with the spirit. These were amulets hidden in different parts of the village and forest. Each time they found an amulet, Lena could feel the forest trying to resist. The trees moved, the whispers grew louder, and the fog grew thicker, cutting off escape routes. Once, as they found the last amulet, the spirit attacked. A huge shadow emerged from the fog, and his voice boomed through the forest. Do you think you can defeat me? I am the earth, I am fear, I am eternal. Lena and Aiden returned to the clearing with the altar. They laid the amulets out in a circle, traced symbols on the ground, and lit candles. Lena felt the spirit gathering all its power to stop them. The fog turned almost black and the air was filled with a stench. The spirit's voice was turning into a scream. This place will never be yours. Aiden started to recite a spell, but the spirit hit him with a powerful wave of energy. Lena was left alone, but she knew this was her fight. She raised her hands to the sky and felt the forest respond to her. His power became her power. You no longer rule this land, she said, looking into the shadow's face. Go away forever. The ritual ended with a flash of light. The shadow disappeared, and the fog cleared. The trees no longer moved, and the forest was filled with the sounds of birds and wind. Lena stood in the clearing, feeling the strength leave her. She knew her sacrifice had not been in vain. Aiden woke up, but Lena was gone. He realized that she had become part of the forest, but now the forest was free. Elm Hollow was no longer a cursed place, and the spirit would never return. Epilogue. The voice of the forest. Several years passed. Aiden would occasionally return to Elm Hollow to make sure the village was alive. The forest was once again a place where people felt peace, not fear. But sometimes, on the quietest nights, he heard whispers. Thank you. It was the voice of Lena, forever the keeper of the freedom of this place. Aiden returned to Elm Hollow less and less often. He knew the village was no longer cursed, and he wanted to believe that Lena had found her peace. One day, however, as he drove past the woods, he noticed something strange. A figure in long dark clothes stood at the edge of the forest. It didn't move, but Aiden felt a chill run down his spine. The figure reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Deciding it was a figment of his imagination, he continued on his way. But when he looked back, the figure was gone. A few days later, Aiden received a strange letter. It was written on old, yellowed paper. It said, Elm Hollow needs you again. They're coming back. There was no signature, but Aiden realized the letter had to do with the forest. He knew this place shouldn't be dangerous anymore. Yet something inside him compelled him to return. When he arrived in the village, the villagers greeted him with alarm. Many said they heard strange noises at night, as if someone was walking through their yards. Others saw strange shadows in the forest. You fixed it, didn't you? Asked an old woman who remembered past events. Aiden didn't know what to answer. He decided to explore the forest. This time the fog was ordinary light and harmless, but still his heart clutched at the memories. Making his way through the thicket, he found an old part of a village he had never seen before. The houses had been destroyed, but on the walls he could still make out symbols similar to those used by the ancient tribes. In the center of the ruins was a new altar. It was much larger than the one Lena had destroyed and seemed recently used. Someone has awakened an old power, Aiden whispered. Aiden went back to the village to warn the people, but no one wanted to listen to him. To them, he was just a strange stranger who had disappeared as quickly as he had appeared last time. Meanwhile, the shadows grew more and more distinct. People began to disappear. First, one of the farmers didn't come home, then an entire family disappeared. Aiden realized that this was just the beginning. Someone had performed a ritual to bring them back, he said to himself. But why? Aiden began to search for answers. He went back to the altar and tried to recreate the ritual to connect with the spirits of the forest. He knew that Lena was still a part of this place. As he began to cast his spells, the mist reappeared. He felt the air grow colder, and whispers filled his ears. "You shouldn't have come back," came Lena's voice. She appeared in front of him, but her face was different. She looked older and haggard now, and her eyes shone with a bright white light. "What's wrong?" Aiden asked. "The place had awakened again. Someone has upset the balance. I can't contain them anymore." Aiden learned that one of the villagers, Mr. Grayson, was a descendant of those who worshipped the spirit. He had found old records and was trying to get the power back to use it for his own power. Aiden and Lena teamed up to stop him, but Grayson already had an army of shadows created from the souls the spirit had absorbed earlier. "He thinks he can control them, but that's a mistake," Lena said. "They will destroy everything." Lena and Aiden gathered the remnants of the forest's magical power. They needed to perform a ritual rite on the new altar to destroy the connection between the shadows and Grayson. At night, they traveled to the ruins. The shadows surrounded them, but Lena used her power to hold them back. Aiden began to read a spell and Grayson appeared out of the mist. "You won't stop me," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sounds of the forest. Lena, sacrificing her essence, channeled all her energy into destroying the altar. When the ritual was complete, the shadows disappeared and Grayson collapsed to the ground, losing his connection to magic. Lena stood in place of the altar, but her body began to fade. "The forest is free now," she said, smiling. "Thank you, Aiden." She vanished into the light, leaving behind only a slight breeze. Epilogue. The New Guardian. Aiden left Elm Hollow knowing that he had done his best. The forest was calm again, and the village had settled into a normal life. But sometimes, walking along the edge of the forest, he could still hear Lena's voice. "This place is safe now." Aiden knew that she would always be there, guarding the forest and its inhabitants. Story 2. A Forgotten Rite. In northwestern Maine, in the heart of a dense forest, sat the village of Black Hollow. The place had been forgotten by time. The roads were overgrown, the houses stood empty, and almost no one knew of its existence. But in the archives of local historians, there were references to strange disappearances and night candles that were lit at the edge of the forest. Young journalist Caroline Rivers decided to investigate America's mysterious places for her blog. After learning about Black Hollow, she traveled there to gather material. However, as she approached the village, she began to have strange dreams. Hooded shadows, whispers in an ancient language, and the sensation of being called. The village greeted Caroline with silence. Half-destroyed houses covered in moss stood along an overgrown road. In the center of Black Hollow was a large square, on which stood a stone monument with carved symbols. The woman took a picture of it, but when she touched the stone, she felt a strange coldness, as if something alive had pierced her hand. At night, Caroline stayed in the old house that had once been a tavern. The night wind blew through the cracks in the walls, and there was a sound like human footsteps outside. At dawn, she found a strange message written in charcoal on the door. "Leave before it's too late." The next day, Caroline found a library in an abandoned school. Among the books were records of an ancient cult that worshipped the Border Guardian, a creature that protected the village from the outside world. To appease it, the villagers held annual sacrificial rituals. But one day the ritual was interrupted, and the spirit became an uncontrollable force, consuming all who dared to enter the forest. Caroline realized that people were disappearing not because of the curse, but because of an awakened guardian who was looking for a new victim to restore the balance. On the third day, Caroline heard whispers calling her deep into the forest. Despite her fear, she decided to follow the voices. The forest grew darker and darker, and the branches of the trees intertwined so that the way back was completely hidden. Soon she found an altar surrounded by ancient symbols. On it lay the remains of old offerings: bones, candles, faded flowers. In front of the altar stood a figure wrapped in a black cloak. "You have come to finish what has been begun," said a voice. Caroline recognized the voice. It had sounded in her dreams. The figure said that the village had made a pact with an ancient spirit to receive protection and prosperity. But one day the villagers stopped honoring their commitment, and the spirit destroyed the village, leaving it in an eternal loop of time. "You must make a choice," said the spirit. "Become part of this forest or free it forever." Caroline remembered the strange symbols on the monument in the center of the village. She decided to go back there to find a clue. Caroline made out the symbols on the monument. They pointed to a special ritual that could break the connection between the village and the spirit. But in order to do that, she had to get back the energy stolen by the forest. She found an old book in the library that described a purification ritual. After preparing everything she needed, Caroline returned to the altar. A thick fog surrounded her and the spirit's voice grew louder. "Do you think you can defeat me?" Caroline began the ritual. The ground beneath her feet trembled and the trees around her began to shrink as if trying to stop her. The spirit appeared before her in the form of a huge shadow with burning eyes. "I am your destiny," he shouted, but Caroline didn't stop. She spoke the last words of the ritual, and light burst through the mist. The spirit screamed, disappearing in a whirlwind of energy. Caroline awoke at the edge of the forest. The village was gone, and with it the darkness that had held the place captive for centuries. She returned home with a sense of accomplishment, knowing that Black Hollow was no longer a threat. But sometimes, as she fell asleep, she heard a faint whisper, "Thank you for your freedom." It had been several months since Caroline had left Black Hollow. She was back to her normal life, but every time she closed her eyes, she was haunted by memories of the misty forest and the dark figure that disappeared into the light. At first she thought it was just a traumatic experience, but as time went on it became clear that it wasn't all that simple. One night, after waking from a nightmare, she noticed that her room, despite the clear weather outside her window, was shrouded in a light fog. The clear, cold air permeated her home as if it were alive. Opening her eyes, Caroline saw a figure standing in the darkness in the corner of her room. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was familiar, but now it sounded not like a whisper, but a deep, commanding timbre. It was the same voice she had heard in the woods. Caroline jumped up from the bed, but the figure was gone, leaving behind only coldness. Following the strange occurrence, Caroline felt her life begin to disintegrate. She could no longer work in peace. Her nightmares were becoming more and more real. On top of that, she could feel her strength drying up with each passing day. Something from Black Hollow had come back with her. She went back to her research, now looking for information about the curse and its effects. She found mentions on old maps and in records that the true power of the forest lay not in a single spirit, but in an ancient entity that controlled all the forces that lived in these places. This entity could be summoned, but to exorcise it required not only the completion of a ritual, but also the complete breaking of the ancient bonds, which was nearly impossible. Caroline, knowing she could no longer remain in the shadow of the curse, returned to Black Hollow. She was willing to risk everything to finish what she had once started. But this time, she knew she had to do more than banish a spirit. She had to destroy the source of the power that sustained all the darkness. As she plunged into the forest, she found that the ground around the altar had been erased, but the essence itself remained. The forest wasn't just a forest. It was a living organism created to sustain the curse. And only by destroying the essence itself could the connection be broken forever. Using the texts found in the library, Caroline performed the final ritual. She stood in the center of the ancient circle, surrounded by silhouettes of trees that began to move and whisper as if reacting to her presence. The fog filled the space again, but now Caroline was ready to face whatever lurked in the forest. The entity appeared before her in the form of a huge, blurry shadow. Fire burned in its eyes, and its body was composed of shadows and light, creating a terrifying sight. "You think you can destroy me?" The shadow prophesied. "Yes, I can, because I know now that you are more than a curse. You are the fear that feeds on this forest. But you cannot defeat me because I am no longer afraid," Caroline replied without averting her gaze. She spoke the last words of the spell, and a tremendous energy exploded. tearing the air. The forest began to disappear, its trees and shadows shrinking and dissolving into light. The shadow screamed, but its voice faded away, dissolving into the air. The curse had been broken. When Caroline returned home, Black Hollow was gone. The village had been wiped out, as if it had never existed. The forest that had hidden it was now just an ordinary forest, and even the fog didn't feel so ominous. But Caroline knew there was no such thing as complete freedom from the shadows of the past in this world. Sometimes, when she passed the old mirror, she thought she saw a figure in a dark cloak appear for a moment in its reflection. But she was not afraid now. She had conquered the darkness. And in the heart of the forest, in the deepest corner of it, the words whispered softly, "You have set us free." Several months had passed since Caroline had broken the curse of Black Hollow. She was back to her life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something hadn't gone away after all. Each day her memories of the village became clearer and clearer, and the strange events never stopped. One day, coming home late at night, Caroline noticed the same figure she had seen in the woods appear at her door. It wasn't just a dream, not an illusion. This time the figure was real, standing right in front of her house. "You freed us," said a low voice that echoed in her head. "But you forgot one thing. We will always be there for you." The figure that had been standing in the darkness suddenly moved in her direction. Caroline's heart beat faster. She knew this wasn't the end. Caroline could no longer ignore these strange events. She turned to researchers and mystics, hoping they would help her find a permanent solution. But everyone she turned to said the same thing. The forest and the entity she had banished were part of an older force, a force that could not be destroyed. It was said that every curse, no matter how it was broken, left a mark on the world. This trace may be invisible to most people, but to those who dare to look for it, it becomes manifest. One of the mystics, an elder named Philip, told her about the awakening, a cyclical process where the shattered forces gather again to test those who have defeated them. You freed them, but in the process you upset the balance. They will return if you don't take them in, he said with sadness in his voice. Caroline realized that she needed to return to the forest and find a way to make peace with what she had freed rather than destroyed. Caroline traveled to Black Hollow again, but this time she wasn't alone. A shadow, the same shadow that had appeared in her dreams and in real life, accompanied her. The forest greeted her as it always did, an abundance of fog and icy cold. Walking to the site of the ruined altar, Caroline sat down on the ground and began to pray. She asked for forgiveness from the forest, from those she couldn't save, and from the entity she had once destroyed. She realized that perhaps her sacrifice had not been complete, and now, to complete everything, she needed to embrace the power rather than fight it. As she finished her ritual, a figure reappeared in front of her. It wasn't just a shadow, but a creature that was part of the forest. Its eyes glowed not with anger, but with sadness. It was silent, but Caroline felt her heart fill with silence and peace. "You have accepted us," the voice said. "We are not enemies, but part of this world. We are guardians, not destroyers. You did not set us free to destroy us, but to understand us." The shadow dissolved into the air and the forest was filled with light. The fog disappeared and the trees, as if awakened, began to blossom. Everything she had done was not just an act of struggle, but an act of acceptance, of merging with what was to be a part of her life. Caroline had returned to her town, but now she knew that Black Hollow, though gone, would never quite go away. The forest was part of her, and she was part of it. Every night as she fell asleep, she felt its presence, like an old friend who was always there but never in the way. He was not an enemy, but part of her own destiny. And sometimes, if you listened closely, you could hear a whisper in the night wind. "You will always be with us."